A racist woman thought Big Shaq didn't belong because of his shoes, his clothes, his silence. She mocked him, humiliated him, and tried to push him out of the room. What she didn't know was who he really was. But when the truth comes out, the entire restaurant freezes, and what follows is a lesson no one in the room will ever forget. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In the glittering heart of Beverly Hills, where the sidewalks shimmer beneath luxury cars, and the whispers of wealth hang in the air like perfume, stands the French Laundry, not just a restaurant but a destination. Tucked behind sleek glass doors, guarded by reputation and reservation lists months long, it exudes the kind of quiet power only true prestige can afford. Crystal chandeliers spill warm light onto marble floors. Tables are set with military precision, white linens unmarred, each plate a sculpted canvas. Here, elegance is not an option, it's the bare minimum. On this particular evening, the dining room buzzed with the gentle clinking of cutlery and murmured conversation. Waiters moved like shadows, seamless and silent. A soft jazz trio played in the far corner, their melodies weaving through the air with just enough presence to remind you they were there, but never enough to intrude. Every seat was occupied. CEOs, celebrities, and old money couples, lost in wine pairings and exclusive small talk. And then the door opened. The maitre d' turned instinctively, his rehearsed smile faltering for half a second as a towering man stepped inside. Shaquille O'Neal, unmistakably massive, unmistakably calm, filled the doorway with a quiet presence that bent the room's atmosphere like gravity. He was dressed simply, a fitted gray t-shirt, worn in sweatpants, and a pair of sneakers that had clearly seen more sidewalks than runways. No entourage, no reservation, just heads turned. Though most tried to pretend otherwise, a few diners narrowed their eyes, unsure of how to reconcile the casually dressed giant with the velvet exclusivity of their sanctuary. Others whispered, wondering if it was really him. Shaq, the legend. Shaq, the MVP. But in a room where dinner conversations often revolved around hedge funds and private jets, a man in sportswear was a visual disruption. Shaq didn't care. His steps were slow, deliberate. He paused near the host stand, scanning the room not with entitlement, but with quiet appreciation, as if he were simply choosing the right painting to study. A waiter stiffened as he approached, but before he could speak, a sharp voice sliced through the velvet quiet. "Good evening," she said, each syllable dipped in polished restraint. "Can I help you?" The speaker was Madison, mid-30s, blonde bob, tailored uniform, eyes like glass. She had worked at the French Laundry for 6 years and carried herself like part of the architecture, flawless, untouchable. Madison wasn't just a server. In her own mind, she was a curator of the experience. And tonight, she didn't like what she saw. Shaq smiled politely. "Just looking to grab a bite. Quiet seat, if that's possible." Her brow arched. "Just slightly. Just enough." "This is the French Laundry," she said with a pause that implied you clearly don't belong here. "We have a dress code, sir, and we're fully booked." Shaq nodded, unfazed. "Understood. If something opens up, even something small in the corner, I'd appreciate it." Behind him, a couple exchanged smirks. A man whispered, "Bold move," to his date, who sipped her wine and didn't respond. Madison didn't budge. "I'll check," she said, her voice flat. "But I can't promise anything." She walked away, leaving Shaq at the stand, like an unscheduled disruption in her perfect gallery. And yet he stood there, at ease, patient. He didn't pace, didn't check his phone. He simply waited, as if even time was beneath the need to hurry. From a central table, Mr. Jonathan, a silver-haired man, in an ivory dinner jacket, watched the scene unfold. He leaned slightly toward his wife without taking his eyes off Shaq. "He's calm," Mr. Jonathan murmured. "Most people would have turned around." Mrs. Jonathan smiled faintly. "That's because he doesn't need to prove anything." Across the room, others had begun to notice. A few more whispers rippled. A woman in a silk gown tilted her head, brows furrowed. A young man seated near the window checked his phone, subtly pulling up Shaq's Wikipedia page. The buzz was building, quietly, like a tremor before a quake. Madison returned. "I found something," she said. "It's not our usual table for guests, but it's available." Shaq simply nodded. "Appreciate it." She turned sharply and began walking. Not toward the central dining hall bathed in soft chandelier light, but toward a shadowed table tucked near the service corridor. It was still part of the dining room, technically, but only barely. The table was clean but sat next to the kitchen swing doors, where the sounds of clinking pans and the occasional shout from the head chef bled into the otherwise composed atmosphere. Shaq followed. As they reached the table, Madison gestured with a hand that didn't invite so much as dismiss. "This spot should match your style." There was no smile on her face, just that same Arctic precision. Shaq sat, smiled faintly. "Thanks." She placed the menu down with just enough force to make a sound. A soft thud that turned heads. Diners watched, trying not to be obvious about it. Madison leaned slightly closer, her voice low but firm. "If you're not planning to order soon," she said with saccharine venom, "there are guests on the wait list who'd be happy to take this table." The moment stretched. Shaq didn't blink. "I'm definitely planning to order," he said. "Looking forward to it." Madison's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. She straightened, pivoted, and walked away, heels clicking against the floor like punctuation marks, to a message she thought she'd just delivered. But she had no idea that the story had only just begun, and that this night, in this temple of quiet luxury, was about to be remembered for something far louder. As Madison walked back toward the host stand, her posture was rigid with professional pride, but her thoughts were laced with disdain. She had scanned Shaquille O'Neal from head to toe, and found nothing that fit the French Laundry's expectations. Not the attire, not the reserved grace expected from regular patrons. She'd seen men like him before, or so she thought, casually dressed, assuming wealth or fame could bypass refinement. In her mind, the rules weren't just policy, they were a test of belonging, and tonight he was already failing. She reached the podium where Shaq still stood, towering and composed, his calm unsettling in its refusal to apologize for his presence. "Good evening," she said again, her tone dipped in polite indifference, the kind that had been weaponized through years of quiet condescension. "As I mentioned, we're typically reservation only. And this is a fine dining restaurant." She let the phrase hang there, deliberately, like a challenge. Shaq's smile didn't falter. "Understood. I'm happy to wait. If anything opens up, even something simple. I'm not picky." But Madison wasn't done. She tilted her head, lowered her voice slightly, but just loud enough to be overheard by a nearby table. "Are you sure?" she asked. "You can afford to eat here?" The words struck the air like an invisible slap. Her tone wasn't overtly cruel, but the insult was unmistakable. A hush rippled through the nearest few tables. Wine glasses paused midair. Forks hovered between plates and lip. The jazz trio in the far corner played on, unaware that the temperature of the room had shifted. Shaq blinked once, slowly. His face remained calm, his body language neutral, but his eyes, dark and unflinching, settled on hers with the weight of 1,000 press conferences. There was no need for outrage. His silence spoke enough. "I'm sure," he replied softly, but with a certainty that pressed through the space between them like a wall of glass. "I'd just like to sit down and enjoy a meal." Madison felt the moment start to slip from her control, but she wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. Not in front of her regulars. Not in front of the men in tailored jackets and women in couture who trusted her to be the filter between the world and their table. She offered a rehearsed smile and turned on her heel. "I'll see what I can do." Shaq remained still, letting the weight of the room settle back into its skin. A few eyes remained on him, some curious, some skeptical, others like Mr. Jonathan watching with increasing interest. Within minutes, Madison returned and gestured toward the back of the restaurant. "We have a seat available," she said, as if bestowing charity. "Follow me." He followed her through the rows of diners, weaving between tables like a ghost among the polished. Every step carried a strange tension, a man with no intention of causing a scene, but whose mere presence was breaking the unspoken order of the place. Madison didn't stop in the warmly lit center of the dining floor. Instead, she led him past the chandeliers, past the laughter and elegance, and toward a dimly lit space adjacent to the kitchen, where the clatter of dishes and bursts of culinary orders were clearly audible. She gestured at a modest table with an almost invisible sigh. "This spot should match your style," she said. Shaq pulled out the chair, nodded once in thanks, and sat. The seat was less than ideal. The table wobbled slightly. There was no centerpiece, but still he made no complaint. His stillness wasn't surrender. It was something else. Something deeper. Madison placed the menu in front of him with a little too much force. The thud echoed softly across nearby tables. She leaned down again, her voice syrupy and biting. "Let me know if you need help with the menu," she said. "Our most popular item is the filet mignon Rossini. It's $350. She didn't blink. She wanted him to feel small, to retreat, to leave on his own, and make her job easier. Shaq glanced at the menu, nodded. "Sounds good. I'll have that." Madison paused, lips parting slightly in disbelief. She hadn't expected that. Not the calm, not the confidence. She'd seen people flinch at the price, but he didn't even blink. "Of course," she said, recovering. "I hope you know how to appreciate it." More eyes turned toward the scene. At the table across from him, a young woman in a green satin dress leaned toward her friend. "Did you hear what she said to him? That was so rude." Her friend, a quiet man in a navy suit, nodded. "She doesn't think he belongs." From the central table, Mr. Jonathan leaned slightly forward, eyes sharp. "Watch him," he whispered to his wife. "He's not rattled. That woman's playing with fire." Back at the reception desk, Madison whispered to her colleague David, deliberately keeping her voice just above a murmur. "He ordered the most expensive thing on the menu. Probably trying to impress someone. But wait until he sees the final bill. I bet he's out before dessert." David glanced over at Shaq, then back at Madison. "Maybe he just wants to eat dinner." Madison smirked. "People like that don't come here just to eat. They come to prove something." Shaq, seated at the far end of the room, opened the menu again and glanced through it casually. He wasn't looking around nervously. He wasn't checking his wallet. He wasn't pretending to be comfortable. He simply was. The clink of silverware resumed. But the tension didn't leave. The room was caught in a slow unraveling. Something was happening. No one knew what exactly. But the air felt charged. Madison passed by his table again. Her tray held high, her steps too precise to be casual. She ignored him entirely as she refilled water glasses and shared polite laughter with guests at another table. Another 10 minutes passed. Shaq remained seated, still not served, still not addressed. At this point, even diners who hadn't been paying attention were beginning to feel it. Jasmine, a young entrepreneur seated near the middle of the room, leaned toward her date. "That server's avoiding him. She sat him next to the kitchen, and hasn't checked in since." Her date frowned. "Why's no one saying anything?" Jasmine's eyes were firm. "Because she's trying to make him leave without telling him to leave." And then Madison returned. She approached slowly, menu in hand once more, an insincere smile on her lips. She leaned just slightly closer than necessary, lowering her voice. "You know," she said, "if you're not sure about this place, if it's too much, there's a casual bistro around the corner. Might be more your speed." This time, there was no question what she meant. It wasn't coded. It wasn't clever. It was dismissal. And it landed like a stone in still water. Across the restaurant, forks hit plates. Glasses stopped mid-sip. The hum of the jazz trio seemed to dim. Even David, her colleague at the host stand, froze. Shaq sat silently for a long moment. Then he slowly turned his head and met her eyes. "I appreciate your concern," he said. His voice as even as still water. "But I'm quite happy right here." And he smiled again. A soft, unbothered smile that didn't need to shout to command the room. Madison stood frozen, unsure whether to fire back or retreat. Before she could decide, a voice from a nearby table cut through the room. "She's unbelievable," someone whispered. "She actually told him to go somewhere else." And just like that, the silence broke. A new tension gripped the air, not from Shaq, who remained calm, but from the room itself, which was suddenly aware that a line had been crossed. Shaq said nothing more. He didn't need to, because now the story wasn't just his. It belonged to every pair of eyes that had witnessed it. The room had settled back into a tense rhythm, but the undercurrent of discomfort pulsed just beneath the surface. Shaquille O'Neal sat calmly at the edge of the French Laundry's prestige-soaked space, surrounded not by luxury but by clattering kitchen doors, dimmer lighting, and a deliberate air of exclusion. Madison had made her move, guided him here like a misfit being escorted out of frame, placed not just far from the best seats but just close enough to the service entrance to remind him of where she believed he belonged. The table wobbled slightly. The chair had a faint chip on one leg, invisible to most but enough to betray the illusion of perfection. The French Laundry fought so hard to maintain. Shaq adjusted himself without complaint, lowering into the seat with grace that seemed borrowed from another world. A world where confidence came from within, not from chandeliers or price tags. Madison, standing over him, placed the menu with a sharp downward motion. The sound, a hollow thud against white linen, echoed faintly across the room, a punctuation mark in an otherwise quiet space. "This table suits your vibe," she said, her voice smooth as silk but laced with something more acidic. She didn't wait for a reply. She turned and walked away, her steps quick, heel clicks deliberate. Shaq opened the menu slowly, his massive hands moving with the kind of control that made even the simplest gesture look ceremonial. His eyes scanned the dishes, the extravagant names, the luxury baked into every price, yet there was no trace of discomfort, only patient observation. From her vantage point near the maître station, Madison watched him with subtle flicks of her eyes, feigning focus on other guests, but never truly letting him out of her sight. She wanted to see if he'd react, sigh, roll his eyes, even get up and leave. But he did. That bothered her more than she'd admit. At the table closest to the kitchen partition, Jasmine, the young entrepreneur in a pearl-trimmed navy blazer, kept her eyes trained on the interaction. She had noticed the way Madison spoke, the false smile, the strategic isolation. She leaned toward her dining companion. She sat him by the kitchen. She whispered, "That's not an accident." Her companion, a reserved man with neatly parted hair, nodded. "She's trying to get rid of him. Slowly. Publicly." Meanwhile, Shaq placed the menu down, folded his hands, and simply waited. The kitchen sounds behind him flared and dipped in rhythm. The sizzling of pans, the barked commands of chefs, the clatter of plates, and yet he seemed completely unfazed. Madison reappeared, a few minutes later, this time holding a tray of drinks for another table. She passed by Shaq without a glance, though her voice rose just slightly in volume, ensuring her words floated just far enough. "If you're not planning to order," she said, addressing no one in particular, "someone else might enjoy this table more." The implication was clear. The audience was targeted. The message landed exactly where she wanted it to, on Shaq, and everyone watching him. A brief silence followed, as if the entire room took one collective breath. Shaq, still seated, turned his head slightly, and looked in her direction. There was no sharpness in his gaze, no outward sign of offense, but his eyes locked onto hers with a quiet, unshakable force that made her falter, only for a second but enough to reveal a crack in her composure. "I'm planning to order," he replied, his tone steady and almost too calm. "No rush." He then turned back to his menu as though the conversation had never happened. Madison walked away with stiffened shoulders, irritated by the fact that he had refused to react in any of the ways she hoped. No anger, no protest, no dramatic exit, just stillness. Poised and composed. At the center table, Mr. Jonathan exhaled slowly, then swirled the wine in his glass. "He's unshaken," he said. "That woman's jabbing at him, like she's testing for a crack. But he's solid." Mrs. Jonathan nodded. "She's expecting a scene, but he won't give her one. That's what's unsettling her the most." Back at the host station, David, a junior server, barely into his 20s, watched the exchange with unease. He wasn't as polished as Madison, but he had a sense for right and wrong that wasn't dulled by routine or arrogance. "She's out of line," he muttered to himself. Madison caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing," David said, looking down quickly, though his jaw clenched tight. She ignored him, pulling out her server pad and gliding back toward the center tables, where regulars laughed and swirled their drinks, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing in the margins of their night. She delivered smiles, banter, and recommendations, with machine-like efficiency, but she kept her ear turned toward the corner where Shaq sat, still quiet, still present. The jazz band's notes grew richer, but the mood didn't follow. The air was taut now, thick with unspoken curiosity and judgment. Several diners had now picked up on the pattern, on the intentional neglect. A few cast quick glances at Madison as she floated between tables, wondering why she hadn't yet taken Shaq's order. 10 more minutes passed. Still no service. Still no follow-up. Still Shaq sat alone. And yet he was the most composed person in the room. He leaned back in his chair, crossed one leg over the other, and glanced toward the musicians. They didn't notice, but Shaq nodded slowly in appreciation of their playing, and then, softly, he tapped his fingers on the table, keeping rhythm. Jasmine finally had enough. "This is ridiculous," she said aloud, her voice a bit louder now. "Why is she ignoring him? Several diners turned their heads. Madison heard the comment, but didn't acknowledge it. Her smile stayed fixed as she poured wine at another table, her hand shaking ever so slightly. David watched her from the host stand. He could feel the energy shifting. It wasn't just one guest noticing anymore. It was the room, the way you could feel when a theater crowd collectively leans in before a reveal. Everyone knew something was happening. Madison finally approached Shaq again, a practiced mask returning to her face. She walked slower this time, steps heavy with silent calculation. When she reached the table, she tilted her head. "Have you decided?" she asked, her voice calm, too calm. Shaq looked up, offering a warm half-smile. "Yes, I'll have the filet mignon Rossini, please." She blinked. "That's our most expensive item." "I noticed," he said. A beat passed. She pressed her lips together. "All right then, I'll put that in." As she turned to leave, her irritation boiled over. She threw a final jab over her shoulder, her voice louder this time, meant for everyone to hear. "Hope he makes it to dessert," she muttered. The murmur that followed was immediate. Diners were no longer pretending not to listen. Faces turned, whispers erupted. Shaq said nothing. He simply leaned forward and unfolded his napkin. David stepped away from the host stand, walking toward the kitchen. He didn't say anything to Madison, but the tension between them buzzed like electricity in the space between their shoulders. Mr. Jonathan tapped his fork gently against his plate, signaling to a nearby waiter. When the young man approached, Mr. Jonathan's voice was low but firm. "Could you ask your manager to come to our table, please?" The waiter nodded and walked away. Shaq, unaware of that request, or perhaps just choosing to ignore it, sat with the calm of a man who had weathered storms far more brutal than this. The aggression here was quieter, but no less cutting. Still, he absorbed every glance, every whisper, every slight, and gave nothing in return but patience. To most it looked like tolerance. To the few who understood, it was strength. Madison re-entered from the kitchen, avoiding Shaq's table this time, her tray now filled with appetizers for another group. She passed by Jasmine's table and caught her glare. "Is there a problem?" Madison asked, her tone saccharine again. Jasmine smiled tightly. "No. But I think there's about to be." Madison's brow twitched. She turned away briskly and delivered her dishes, but her rhythm was faltering now. The control she'd held at the beginning of the evening was slipping through her fingers, and it was only a matter of time before it was gone entirely. "So just to confirm," she said, voice edged with mock surprise, "you're going with the filet mignon Rossini. That's $350. Shaq didn't flinch. He looked up at her with the same measured calm he had worn all evening. A soft smile curved on his face. "Yes," he said. "That's the one." A pause. Her pen hovered. Dramatic. "You're sure?" she pressed again, tilting her head slightly. "I am," he said. "I'm looking forward to it." There was nothing confrontational in his tone, but it landed like a gavel in a courtroom. The table behind him fell silent. Across the room, Jasmine exchanged a knowing look with her companion. She leaned closer to whisper, but her voice carried to a few other nearby guests. "She's embarrassing herself now." Her date nodded. "He's handling it better than anyone else in here would." Madison wrote down the order and snapped her notepad closed with a subtle flourish, offering nothing more than a thin-lipped smile before walking away. But the performance wasn't over. She passed David at the host stand and leaned in with a smirk, not bothering to lower her voice. "Ordered the most expensive dish, probably trying to prove something," she said. "They always pick the flashiest thing on the menu. Wait until the bill comes. He'll fold." David, still uncomfortable but unsure how to respond without escalating things, offered a muted nod and looked away. He was young, newer to the job, and not yet equipped to challenge someone like Madison in front of a full house. But even he could feel the tension tightening like piano wire. Shaq, meanwhile, remained a model of composure. He sat with his hands folded on the linen, his eyes drifting across the room, not aimlessly, but with quiet intention. He noticed the glances. He sensed the shifting energy. He wasn't oblivious to the murmurs or Madison's snide remarks, but he also understood something deeper. This wasn't about him. Not really. It was about who people assumed he was. And in that he had the advantage. The band played on, the saxophone bleeding out a slow, soulful tune. Shaq tapped his fingers gently along the edge of the table, not to make noise, but to feel the rhythm of the room. He didn't rush it. He let Madison's assumptions hang where she left them, like smoke waiting to clear. At the center table, Mr. Jonathan adjusted his jacket and murmured to his wife, "She's drawing too much attention to herself." Mrs. Jonathan nodded, her expression drawn. She's trying to push him out, but all she's doing is making herself look foolish. And indeed, the energy had begun to shift. What started as subtle curiosity was turning into collective awareness. Diners were beginning to understand. Some whispered. Others simply watched, unsure of whether to intervene or let the moment pass. The divide was growing, not just between Madison and Shaq, but among the room itself, between those who silently condoned what was happening by doing nothing, and those who were beginning to feel complicit in their silence. Madison, however, hadn't caught on. She moved from table to table, throwing glances in Shaq's direction between courses and commentary. Her tone was upbeat with other guests, her posture relaxed, but she couldn't help herself. Each time she passed his table, her comments grew sharper, thinly veiled, but obvious enough for anyone paying attention. At one point, while pouring wine for a couple near the front, she casually said, "We've been getting all kinds of guests lately. People walking in thinking they can just blend in. No reservation, no decorum." She laughed lightly as if it were a joke. The couple gave her a forced smile, but neither of them laughed with her. Back near the kitchen, Shaq remained seated. His meal hadn't arrived yet, but he didn't seem impatient. He had shifted his position slightly, one arm resting on the table, the other on his lap, his gaze steady. He was aware that he was now the center of a silent play, but he didn't need to change roles to influence the story. He was already doing it, without raising his voice or demanding attention. David emerged from the back carrying a tray of appetizers. As he passed Shaq's table, he hesitated briefly, then leaned down just enough to speak without being overheard. "Your order's coming up, sir," he said. "Just a few more minutes." Shaq nodded. "Thank you." David straightened, but not before offering a brief, apologetic smile. It was the first genuine expression Shaq had received from the staff all evening, and it didn't go unnoticed. Across the room, Jasmine watched the brief exchange and turned to her companion. "Did you see that? The younger server, he gets it." Her friend nodded. "She's losing the room." And she was. What had begun as Madison's controlled environment was now slipping through her grasp. The social mirror had flipped. Diners were now looking not at Shaq to see if he belonged, but at her, questioning her professionalism, her intentions, her prejudices. The whispers no longer revolved around whether Shaq was out of place. They revolved around her behavior. At the dessert table, an elderly woman with silver hair, Mrs. Hamilton, sipped her tea, her expression unreadable. Her granddaughter leaned in. "Do you think she knows who he is?" she asked. Mrs. Hamilton didn't answer right away. She set her cup down with care. "She doesn't need to," she said. "You don't need to know someone's name to treat them with dignity." The sentence hung in the air like a benediction. Back at the host station, David turned to Madison. "Do you think maybe you're being a little harsh?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Madison looked at him like he'd just stepped out of line in front of a guest. "I'm doing my job," she said. "Not my fault some people don't fit the atmosphere here." David didn't argue, but he no longer looked uncertain. He turned his attention toward the dining room again, watching the reactions, taking mental notes. The line had been crossed, and people were starting to pick sides. At last Madison returned to Shaq's table, this time carrying a gleaming silver tray. The dish filet mignon Rossini was plated like a piece of art, seared to perfection, glazed in truffle reduction, crowned with foie gras. She lowered it onto the table, with the precision of a trained hand, but the force was just a hair too aggressive, the plate clicking against the surface with a muted echo. "There you go," she said. "I hope you can appreciate it." Shaq looked down at the dish, then up at her. "It looks incredible," he said. "Thank you." She hovered a moment longer, as if waiting for him to make a mistake, to mispronounce something, to ask a question that would prove her point. But he didn't. He picked up his fork and knife with grace and began to cut into the meat. And then just before turning, she added one more line, delivered with a sugar-sweet smile. "If this isn't your thing, we do have simpler options available. You know, in case this is a bit much." Shaq paused briefly, lifted his eyes, and replied softly, "I'll let you know." It was subtle, but it was sharp, because everyone watching understood what she had really meant, and they saw that he had chosen restraint again. Back at the central table, Mr. Jonathan had finally had enough. He motioned once to the nearest staff member. "Would you mind getting the manager?" he asked. I think it's time. The waiter nodded and hurried off. At the far end of the room, Madison stood frozen for a moment, unsure of whether her final remark had landed. She looked around, and for the first time that evening, noticed how many eyes were on her. Not curious. Not amused. Judging. The room wasn't just watching anymore. It was responding. The mirror had turned. Madison stood near the center of the dining floor, her arms crossed behind her back, in a posture that feigned professionalism but radiated dissatisfaction. Her jaw was tight, her posture straighter than usual, like someone clinging to a kind of authority that no longer felt natural. She hadn't said a word to Shaquille O'Neal since she served his meal, but the comment still danced on the tip of her tongue, daring to erupt. As she watched Shaq cut into his dish with deliberate elegance, her annoyance swelled. He hadn't cracked, not once. He hadn't stumbled over the menu, hadn't asked for substitutions, hadn't winced at the price, hadn't looked out of place, at least not in the way she'd hoped. And the worst part, he hadn't said a thing about her behavior. He wasn't reacting, and somehow that made her feel smaller than any confrontation could have. Unable to restrain herself, she turned slightly, her voice rising under the cover of a chuckle, projecting across several tables. Some people, she said, as if sharing an inside joke with the guests beside her, come in here pretending to belong. Bet he's gone before dessert. The laughter she expected never arrived. A couple near her shifted uncomfortably. A younger woman narrowed her eyes and looked away. The man beside her whispered something that made her frown. Madison caught it but couldn't make out the words. Either way, she could feel the weight of judgment curling around her now. Not from Shaq, but from the room. Shaq, still seated near the kitchen, didn't so much as lift his eyes. He continued eating with quiet dignity, every motion smooth and intentional. He chewed slowly, as if savoring not just the food, but the quiet unraveling of everything Madison had tried to control. He had said less than a few dozen words since he entered the restaurant, and yet he had become the center of gravity in the room. Not by force, but by presence. At the central table, Mr. Jonathan observed everything. His fingers gently traced the stem of his wine glass, his eyes not missing a single cue. He doesn't need to speak, he murmured, leaning slightly toward his wife. He already owns the moment. Mrs. Jonathan nodded, her gaze shifting between Madison and Shaq. The louder she gets, the smaller she looks. Nearby, Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. She wasn't watching Shaq anymore. She was watching Madison, and so were many others. Every new remark Madison made landed with less impact, not because people weren't hearing them, but because they had begun to see her clearly. Her attempts at control, her veiled sarcasm, her power plays. They had once been invisible, built into the script of elite service, but now the mask was slipping. Madison, sensing that something was off, forced another smile. She approached a couple seated at the far end and tried to recapture her rhythm. "Everything to your liking?" she asked, her tone a little too bright. The man nodded politely, but his eyes flicked toward Shaq's table and then back to hers. "It's been enlightening," he said. She blinked, unsure how to take the comment, and moved on. Meanwhile, David stood near the edge of the kitchen, fidgeting with a napkin. He had seen it all. The comments, the glances, the manipulation. His instinct told him to say something, but his position told him to wait. Still, his discomfort was growing. Every time Madison passed him, he wanted to speak up, but the power dynamic was clear. She was senior. She was confident. She was untouchable. Or so it seemed. Until now, because something was changing in the air. And it wasn't coming from the staff. It was coming from the diners. A man in a tailored navy suit, near the fireplace, stood slowly and walked over to the host stand. He leaned in, his voice low. "Could you please ask the manager to join us at table 9, he asked. The hostess blinked, startled. "Of course, sir. Is there a problem?" "Not yet," the man replied, "but there will be if that woman speaks to that guest one more time like he doesn't belong here." The hostess paled and nodded, immediately disappearing through the side hallway that led to the back offices. Madison returned to the floor, still pretending everything was normal, but even she could feel the shift. Conversations no longer flowed freely. Guests weren't laughing. Some had stopped eating. They were watching, processing, aligning their thoughts into something collective. The dining room wasn't reacting to her cues anymore. She passed by Shaq's table again, holding a pitcher of water she had no intention of using. As she approached, she paused just long enough to say, under her breath but loud enough for him and nearby tables to hear, Careful you don't stain the linen. Shaq didn't even look up. He simply placed his fork down beside the plate and took a sip of water. Then, without glancing at her, he spoke. You know what I find interesting? Madison hesitated, caught off guard. What's that? She replied, trying to sound indifferent. He finally looked at her. Calm, even. But his gaze was no longer passive. It was focused. You've worked really hard tonight, he said slowly, to show everyone who doesn't belong. But the longer you try to prove it, the more people start to wonder if it's you. Madison's face froze. Her mouth parted slightly, but nothing came out. He picked up his fork again and returned to his meal. The interaction had lasted no more than 10 seconds, but its impact was immediate. Nearby tables shifted with an energy that bordered on applause. No one clapped, but their eyes did. Their silence did. It was as if he had finally said what the entire room had been thinking, but he had done it without a raised voice or a single insult. Just Madison stood for a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the service station. Her cheeks burned with a flush she couldn't hide. For the first time in her career at the French Laundry, she felt something she hadn't in a long time, watched, judged, and out of place. Moments later, the manager emerged. Mr. Thompson, impeccably dressed and always composed, walked onto the floor with brisk purpose. He didn't announce himself. He didn't ask questions. He went straight to table 17, Shaq's table. Shaq looked up, and a flicker of recognition passed between them. Mr. O'Neill, Thompson said, dipping his head slightly, we're honored to have you with us. I apologize deeply for what you've experienced tonight. We weren't aware you'd be joining us. The room fell into silence. Not the polite kind, but the stunned kind. The kind that ripples through gold-plated silverware and fine bone china. Madison, standing at the corner of the service bar, went rigid. Please, Thompson continued. If there's anything you need, we're here for you. Shaq gave a polite nod. Appreciate it. Just wanted dinner, that's all. Thompson turned toward the staff station, and his eyes met Madison's. Her breath caught. He didn't speak to her. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Across the dining room, a woman at table 6 whispered. Did he say O'Neill? As in, Shaquille O'Neal? Her husband's jaw dropped slightly. Oh my God. I thought he looked familiar. Jasmine sat up straighter. And she treated him like that. Now the narrative was no longer just uncomfortable. It was unacceptable. The social mirror had fully cracked, flipped, and reflected back on everyone in that room, forcing them to face what they had seen, what they had ignored, and who had spoken up. Shaq's silence had been louder than any outburst. His grace, more impactful than any confrontation. He didn't need to correct Madison. The room had already begun doing it for him. Madison stood in the shadows now, shrinking beneath the glow of the chandeliers she once thought made her powerful. The shift was complete. The power had changed hands, and it had never required a single raised voice. Shaq waved a hand. No worries. I was just enjoying the food. Across the room, people exchanged looks, guilt, awe, confusion, discomfort. The woman in the pearl necklace who had chuckled earlier now kept her gaze fixed on her plate. The man who had raised an eyebrow at Shaq's sneakers now glanced at his own designer shoes with silent awkwardness. The energy had shifted completely, and not because of any declaration, but because of who they now understood had been watching them all along. And Madison? She was unraveling silently. Her confident posture had deflated, and her hands trembled just enough to betray the storm inside. All her assumptions, all her smug remarks, all her power plays were now stacked into a tower built on nothing. And it had collapsed the moment the truth walked in and introduced itself by name. David, watching from the host's stand, didn't say a word, but his shoulders relaxed for the first time that night. His eyes found Madison's and held there just long enough to let her know he saw it too. The reversal, the fall. Mr. Jonathan took a slow sip of his wine, never taking his eyes off Shaq. Then, placing the glass down, he said to his wife, he never needed to prove anything. That was her mistake. Mrs. Jonathan nodded slowly. She wasn't just rude. She was blind. Near table 5, Jasmine turned to her date with wide eyes. I can't believe this. He owns part of this restaurant, and she treated him like a trespasser. She was so sure of herself, her date muttered. Now look at her. Madison forced herself to move. She walked briskly back toward the service station, each step stiff, mechanical, her mind trying to process the collapse of the narrative she had written in her head, the one where she had the control. where she could reduce a man to his sneakers and seat him by the kitchen without consequence. But now the consequence wasn't punishment, it was exposure. And it was unfolding in silence. Back at Shaq's table, Mr. Thompson leaned closer. "If you'd prefer another table, I c-" Shaq raised a hand gently. "No need. This one's fine." That sentence alone twisted the knife. Not for Shaq, but for the room. Because it wasn't just a declaration of comfort. It was a demonstration of grace, of restraint, of a man who had let the insult pass so everyone else could see it for what it truly was. Madison returned to the prep station, where another server offered a glass of water she didn't take. Her throat was dry, her hands twitchy. The voice inside her head was louder than anything else now, replaying every line she'd spoken, every time she'd narrowed her eyes or tilted her chin with false superiority. She heard whispers again. But this time she knew they were about her. She turned to see a guest motioning for the manager. Another one did the same. The dominoes were falling, not because someone pushed them, but because they'd been stacked carelessly, on ego and bias. Mr. Thompson left Shaq's table and moved with practiced composure to the concerned guests. He listened, nodded, and then returned toward the back hallway. Madison's heart began to pound. She didn't need to be told. She knew. At the edge of the dining floor, Shaq picked up his fork again and resumed his meal. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, savoring the moment, not as a victory, but as a statement that dignity isn't something you wear, it's something you carry. And tonight, while everyone else had been watching what he wore, he had been showing them who he was. The whispers continued. But now they were different. "Did you hear what he said to her?" He never even raised his voice. "He's teaching all of us a lesson without even trying." Madison stood behind the service station, partially shielded from the guests but fully exposed in every other way. Her face was pale, her jaw locked. A part of her wanted to walk out the back door and disappear into the night. Another part of her, smaller but louder, knew she couldn't. Not yet. From his seat, Shaq glanced toward her once. Just briefly. There was no malice in his gaze. Only a message. "You've been seen. Now it's your turn to see." Back at the center table, Mr. Jonathan let out a soft sigh. "You know what the real twist is," he said, mostly to himself. "She thought he didn't belong, but in the end, she's the one who doesn't." It was a sentence that seemed to echo across the dining room. Not shouted, not emphasized, but received, nonetheless. As Mr. Thompson approached Madison quietly from behind, placing a hand gently on her shoulder and gesturing for her to step aside, the moment landed. No dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, just accountability unfolding in real time, delivered with the same quiet elegance Shaq had shown all night. And as she followed the manager toward the back corridor, every step felt heavier than the last. Because now the truth wasn't just revealed, it was undeniable. The dining room had shifted into a kind of respectful silence, not the kind born of reverence, but the stillness that follows realization. The entire space now moved around a new center of gravity, not Madison's authority, not the chandeliers, not the prestige of the French Laundry itself, but Shaq, seated quietly, still in his seat, near the kitchen, surrounded by a silence that now echoed louder than the jazz trio ever had. Madison stood near the entrance of the corridor behind the service bar. Mr. Thompson had not said much when he gestured her aside. He didn't need to. The judgment hadn't come from him. It had already been passed by the room, by the whispers, by the shifting glances, and by her own recognition that the performance she had been staging all evening was now playing in reverse. She stood frozen for a few moments before finally turning, not toward the kitchen or the exit, but surprisingly toward Shaq. Her steps were slow, uncertain, stripped of the confidence that had laced them earlier in the night. She walked not like a server gliding across the floor, but like a woman stepping into a moment she could no longer delay. The stairs followed her, the atmosphere quiet and taut. Shaq watched her approach without judgment. His hands rested on the table, his posture straight but calm. He didn't rise. He didn't shift. His composure remained unmoved, not by superiority, but by something deeper: conviction. Madison finally stopped at his table, just beside the chair she had once shoved toward him, as if assigning him to the shadows. Her eyes didn't meet his at first. She stared at the corner of the table, the edge of the linen, anywhere but his face. But eventually she had to look up, and when she did, her voice was smaller than she remembered it ever being. I didn't know who you were," she said. The words were meant to explain. maybe even to apologize. But they came out like a hollow excuse, their weight evaporating the second they left her mouth. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her shoulders tense, and yet the moment remained mercifully still. Shaq tilted his head slightly, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement. His voice, when it came, was soft and direct. "That's the point," he said. "You shouldn't need to." The sentence hit like a gavel, not cruel, not angry, but unshakable. A few tables away, a man whispered under his breath, "Damn." His date reached across the table and took his hand, not out of romance but solidarity. Everyone in the room could feel it. Not just the tension, but the truth. Madison blinked rapidly. "I didn't mean to." Shaq didn't interrupt, but he did raise a hand gently, and the motion alone made her fall silent. "I've been in a lot of places where people expect something from me," he said. "Respect, fame, gratitude. But what I've learned, what I keep learning, is that the most important respect is the one we offer before we know a single thing about someone. It's easy to be kind when you recognize someone. The test is how you act when you don't." He wasn't angry. There wasn't a trace of bitterness in his voice. In fact, his words weren't even about himself anymore. They were about the room, the people listening, the kind of place this restaurant claimed to be, and the kind of people it claimed to serve. Madison lowered her eyes. Her arms, which had always moved with purpose, now hung limply at her sides. She felt exposed, not by the room, but by herself. Her actions, her assumptions, her tone, they played back like an embarrassing monologue she hadn't realized the mic was on for. "You seated me near the kitchen," Shaq continued, still calm, still steady. "You made comments about what I could afford. You questioned why I came here. But what if I were just a regular man? What if I weren't anybody? Would it be okay then?" Madison's lips parted, but no answer came. He leaned in slightly, not aggressively, but with focus. Every guest deserves dignity. Not because they're rich, not because they're famous, but because they're human. The words rippled outward. You could feel them land on the room. People who had said nothing now felt implicated. People who had laughed nervously at Madison's remarks now looked away, silently reckoning with the part they'd played, even in their silence. Mr. Jonathan exhaled slowly at his table, watching the exchange unfold like a masterclass in humanity. "He's not just correcting her," he said quietly to his wife. "He's correcting all of us." Mrs. Jonathan nodded. "And he's doing it without ever raising his voice." Madison took a shaky breath. I really am sorry." Shaq looked at her, finally looked at her. Not with disdain, but with clarity. He nodded once. "Then be better," he said. "Not just here. Everywhere. Because someone's watching. Maybe not someone important to you. Maybe not someone you'll ever meet again. But they'll remember how you made them feel. Every time." A long silence followed. Not awkward, not strained, but meaningful. The kind of silence that comes after a truth that didn't need fanfare. From behind Madison, Mr. Thompson approached again. He stood at a respectful distance but didn't interrupt. "I'd like to speak with the team after closing," Shaq said, his eyes still on Madison. "Not to punish anyone, just to remind us why we do this in the first place." Mr. Thompson nodded with complete agreement. "Absolutely." Shaq leaned back slightly in his chair and offered one last quiet sentence. "It's easy to forget people are watching, but sometimes that's exactly what we need to remember." Madison nodded. Her eyes welled slightly, but she blinked the tears back. This wasn't the moment for breakdowns. It was the moment for acknowledgement, for growth. And deep inside she knew she had deserved every word of it. Not because she had been caught, but because she had been wrong. She took a small step back, then another, retreating with dignity not given by others but earned in her willingness to hear, to listen. She would carry this moment longer than anyone else in the room, because she had been the one to learn the most. Shaq picked up his fork again, cutting into the remaining piece of steak with the same grace he had displayed all night. The jazz trio resumed softly. Conversations picked up again, quiet, thoughtful, and changed. From her table, Jasmine raised her glass slightly in Shaq's direction and whispered, "To Grace under fire." Her friend nodded, clinking glasses. "And to calling people in, not just calling them out." The moment had passed, but the lesson lingered in every corner of the restaurant. From the servers at the back to the wealthy couples near the fireplace, everyone had witnessed something rare, not a confrontation, but a reckoning. And it was done without shouting, without spectacle, without hate, just truth. delivered gently, but with the weight of something unforgettable. He let the words land before continuing. This place, it isn't defined by the price tags on the menu. It's not defined by Michelin stars or celebrity guests. It's defined by the people who run it, who serve in it. You all are the soul of this restaurant. And if the soul forgets how to see people, really see them, then no amount of polish will save it. David, standing near the host stand, lowered his head slightly. He'd felt this instinctively earlier in the evening, but hearing it spoken aloud gave it weight. It made his silence feel like a missed chance, one he promised himself he wouldn't miss again. Then Shaq looked directly at Madison. She stiffened slightly but held his gaze. She expected blame, maybe even a public scolding. But what she received was something far more devastating and healing. "You made a mistake," he said. "But so have I. So has every person in this room. That's not what defines us. What matters is what we do after." Her throat tightened. The words weren't angry. They weren't coded in superiority. They were steady, measured, and somehow, that made them even harder to bear. "I failed," she said quietly, stepping forward without prompting. "Not because I didn't recognize you, but because I judged you. I assumed, and I treated you as less." The room stayed silent. Every head now turned toward her. This wasn't a spectacle. It was confession. "I let the uniform become a wall," she continued. "And I let this place convince me that belonging came with a dress code. But tonight, I saw myself clearly, and I didn't like it." Shaq nodded once. Not in forgiveness, that had already been implied, but in understanding. "That change," he said, "that realization, that's the beginning. Don't waste it." She nodded, her voice breaking slightly. "I won't." He turned back to the group. "You're in a powerful position here," he said. "Every night you shape how people feel about themselves. You may not realize it, but your smallest actions, the way you look at someone, speak to someone, where you seat them, those are the things people carry. Long after dessert, long after the bill." There were nods now. Real ones. From servers who had worked years perfecting silent glances and measured tones. From line cooks who had never considered the impact of who walked in the door. From bartenders and hosts who understood, perhaps for the first time, that fine dining wasn't just about flavor, it was about feeling. "I'm not asking for perfection," Shaq said. "I'm asking for awareness, for humility, and for kindness. Not when it's easy, but when it's inconvenient." A beat of silence. "And most of all," he added, "I'm asking you to remember that every guest who walks through that door deserves dignity. Not because they've earned it, but because they're human." It was then that Mr. Thompson stepped forward, breaking his silence. He cleared his throat, looking at his staff with a softness rarely seen. "Thank you, Shaq," he said, "for saying what needed to be said, for doing what most people in your position wouldn't have." Shaq gave a small smile. "I didn't come here to teach a lesson, but sometimes, life gives you the stage anyway." He began to step back but then paused. "I hope," he said, "this place becomes what it claims to be. Not just great in food or service, but great in spirit." As he turned and began walking toward the exit, the team remained still, watching not a celebrity, not a guest, but a man who had just offered them a mirror and the chance to grow from it. Madison didn't move. Her eyes followed him until he disappeared past the velvet curtain separating the dining room from the lobby. And then she turned to the rest of the staff. "I want to do better," she said. "And I hope I'm not the only one." David nodded. So did two others. It spread from person to person. Not applause, not performance, but a quiet agreement. A commitment. From that night forward, the French Laundry wouldn't just be a name etched in gold outside a glass door. It would become a place not defined by who it served, but how. And Madison? She wouldn't forget this night. Not because she was humiliated, but because she was transformed. For Shaq, the real moment was just beginning. He stepped through the front doors, with the same ease with which he had entered hours earlier, unrushed, grounded, certain of who he was. But everything around him had shifted. The staff had learned something. The diners had seen something. And the space he left behind was no longer the same room it had been when he first arrived in sneakers and quiet expectation. Outside, the pavement glistened faintly, still holding the day's warmth. Shaq walked slowly beneath the street lamps, his large figure casting long shadows across the polished sidewalk. His steps were steady, his breath even. He wasn't in a hurry to leave. There was nothing to run from, no anger chasing him, No score to settle, only clarity and the weight of the lesson he had lived, delivered and left behind. He looked up at the clear sky, the stars barely visible behind the soft glow of city light. A breeze stirred the palm trees lining the street, their leaves rustling like whispers. He paused near the edge of the block and took in the stillness, his hands resting at his sides, his expression unreadable but peace. Tonight hadn't been about humiliation, though it had tried to be. It hadn't been about power, though many had mistaken it for that. And it hadn't been about recognition, though in the end, that's what had flipped the script. It had been about the unseen weight people carry, the quiet fight to be seen not for fame, or wealth, or image, but for who they are when they strip all of it away. He thought about Madison, the defensiveness in her voice when she said she didn't know who he was, the slow crumble of her posture when she realized that wasn't the point. He didn't hate her for it. He pitied how long she had walked in a world that made her believe authority came from arrogance, but he had seen something in her eyes before he left. Not shame, not just guilt, a readiness to change. That, more than anything, stayed with him. He remembered something an old coach once told him, not during a game, but after a rough press day when he'd been misunderstood, reduced to a statistic. The real win, the coach had said, is when you don't have to prove who you are, because your presence already has. Shaq breathed in deeply and spoke softly into the silence of the night. The world needs more kindness, he murmured, his voice low, steady. And it starts with how we see each other, without assumptions, without prejudice. He didn't say it like a quote. He said it like a reminder to himself, to the air, to the shadows around him. As he continued walking down the block, the city's usual gloss softened. It wasn't about the flash tonight, not the brands, the cars, or the carefully manufactured elegance of the storefronts lining the street. It was about something quieter, something more enduring, the kind of truth that doesn't fade with the lighting. The French Laundry would continue serving 5-star meals, pouring rare vintages, booking guests months in advance, but something invisible had changed inside its walls tonight. The lesson wasn't just for Madison. It wasn't even just for the staff. It was for everyone who witnessed the unraveling and the rebuilding of perception. A reminder that refinement is meaningless without compassion, that respect doesn't hang on a tuxedo or a title. Back inside, the last few staff members finished resetting the room for morning. David lingered near the wine shelf, his thoughts miles away. Madison stood near the bar, her apron now folded neatly on the counter, her eyes scanning the empty tables. But what she saw wasn't linen or cutlery, it was moments. Things she could never take back, and yet could build something new from. "Do you think he meant what he said?" she asked quietly, turning toward David. David nodded without looking up. Every word. Madison didn't reply. She didn't need to. The change had already started. Not with an apology, not even with her confession, but with her decision to stand there, in the aftermath, and face it. Down the block, Shaq reached the corner and stopped. Across the street, a neon diner buzzed softly in contrast to the clean elegance of the restaurant behind him. A couple laughed inside. A cook flipped a burger behind the counter. No tuxedos, no wine lists. Just people, being people. He smiled faintly. Some lessons didn't need marble floors and jazz bands to matter. He turned to glance back once more at the French Laundry, its facade glowing like a quiet witness to what had unfolded. No plaque would be hung there to mark the evening. No headline would summarize the shift, but it would live in the memory of every person who saw it. Not just the mistake, but the response. Not the insult, but the grace that countered it. Shaq turned again and began walking down the street, disappearing slowly into the halo of Beverly Hills light. He didn't just leave a restaurant. He left behind a message, one that would echo far longer than the night. And quietly, the world turned. If this story stirred something in you, it means you're the kind of person who sees beyond the surface. We bring you moments that reveal character, test values, and remind us who we are when no one's watching. Stick around, because the next story might just challenge the way you see the world. And trust us, it'll be one you won't forget.